So we talked about this last week. I don't want my drawing to be too complicated. I don't want to over describe anything. The goal of my drawing is really to get everything in the right spot for the portrait, especially if you want to get that capture the likeness of the person. We want to make sure it's accurate, but accurate doesn't necessarily mean complicated. A couple of things I'm looking at right from the start are just how close to the outside edges of the frame of the picture is like the silhouette, the outer contour of the figure. I can worry about all that head construction stuff we talked about last week after I get my composition figured out, but not the other way around.
Shane, I didn't hear your response when Ross was asking you about when you start off, do you mostly just do freehand um, when you're sketching out like a face, or do you use like a grid system or anything like that?
Not necessarily a grid system, but it's just those like head construction designs we talked about last week.
It's just based on your knowledge of the anatomy.
Yeah, the more you study like the skull and the planes of the head, the more intuitive that'll become. And then when I look at a head or a face, I'm kind of just drawing that and then adjusting it to fit the person that I'm trying to draw.
Okay.
And I guess the things that we can focus on are the patterns that like the similarities from person to person are a good place to start. Like for the brow being about halfway down the head, that's a useful measurement, and the tops of the ears generally lining up with the top of the brow, even though we can't see the ear in this one. The base of the nose being about halfway down from there. Those are pretty reliable things. Like this, that edge of the eye socket there running into the cheekbone. So I guess what I'm looking for are those landmarks that I know are important. Like they're a big part of the likeness because number one, they don't really move around a lot. They're like really pretty rigid structures compared to something like the mouth is like a lot softer and moves around a ton and can be really expressive. Like the bridge of the nose meeting the eye sockets is like really reliable, and a lot of the likeness is in there. And I think a lot of the our own facial recognition kind of stuff, like I feel like that's living in that area too. So like if we don't get that right, we're going to be chasing a lot more, spending a lot more time chasing the likeness. So that's what I look for more than just kind of copying the details I see on the surface. Those are, it's not that they're not important, but that kind of happens way more towards the end. Like what you might see with like wrinkles in the skin or something, or even like something like facial hair, like we might attach to someone as being part of who they are and their identity and that's what their face means. But those are all things that are happening on the surface. I want to build this like a portrait painting is really, it all starts with like a head drawing, and building that up from the ground up or from the inside out is the best way to do it. And even if that stuff isn't totally obvious in like my initial drawing, whether I'm making a finished drawing or if this is just a sketch for a painting, it might not be that obvious because a lot of that might, I might just be thinking about that in my head. Rather, I'm not going to like map out all of those planes that we did last week, but I'm still thinking about it. like right here, we mentioned this earlier, like this inside corner of the eye socket near that inside tear duct. I like kind of following that straight down to where the nostrils meeting the face there. That tells me a lot about where the nose is. And at a certain point, I don't want this drawing to get, it's not so much about adding more and more information. It's like, okay, I drew the nose in a really basic structural way. Now I can draw the nostril, and then I can draw the nose hairs under the nostril. Like, I'm gonna just keep moving things around. I'm trying to make them more and more accurate without making it more and more complicated. And so it's more about like rearranging the pieces until they're in the perfect place. That takes time and measuring. That's what I'm spending time doing right now. Not trying to make a really detailed finished drawing. I know I say it like almost every week. I feel like that details are kind of deceiving and they're not necessarily what we're after.
Shane, do you ever think about using like a water soluble pencil, just so you don't have to erase it with
Yes.
with watercolor?
Yeah. So then I would want to be using the right color for every mark that I make too. If I was moving, if I only had maybe 20 minutes to do this, maybe I would then. But since I have a couple hours, I'm going to use the pencil to really like there's so much to juggle between like form, like the kind of edges that I'm finding, the different values and the different colors, different temperatures. There's so much to juggle there that it's hard to do that all at once and get like an accurate drawing for the portrait. So by just focusing on the portrait and doing this sketch, I'm just looking for like accuracy in all the structures here that we're talking about. And then I can worry about color later. I'd rather do that and then erase most of these lines. And then I have like a blueprint that I can trust. And trusting my sketch is like really helpful because then I can really put most of my focus into getting the like a warm shadow running into a cooler light shape and getting that the form of that to turn in the perfect way. That can take just as much focus. So if I can put more energy into that and less about like, okay, is this eye even in the right place? I think it'll be better. But it all depends on the kind of painting we want to make, the amount of time that we have. And I haven't used them too much, the water soluble pencils. I should try them more. I like the water soluble graphite, if just for like black and white stuff. I'd like to try that more. This all started from one of those actually. I have it. I think I have it here. Pull it up. This is from a sketch from a little while back. So I mapped it out with a red colored pencil really lightly, just because that's what I had nearby. And then I used a water soluble, like a stick of like water soluble graphite, and then I painted out and around that from the photo. But then I thought it'd be fun for class. So I like it for that reason. A little bit faster and looser. I think I gotta see, when I started out, I was saying I don't want to get too caught up on all of the construction stuff too early because I do want to pay attention to my composition. Oh man, I just scratched it with some charcoal that was left over in my eraser. See, I shouldn't just let these erasers sit in my drawer there because they can collect little bits of charcoal and whatever else is rolling around in there, and then they get embedded in the eraser, and then you can drag it across something fragile like watercolor paper and just wreck it. But we talked about composition like I want to say 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. I want to be thoughtful about like the amount of space around his head. It's really tempting to just kind of start drawing a really detailed face without thinking about where the head actually lives on here. So I wanted to make it a little bit smaller. And I worked that out in the photo, like arranging it in Photoshop the way that I did. So in a way, the reference image is like a compositional sketch. So I think the face was kind of big and the eyes were a little bit low. But that's something I want to realize and fix now and not in 2 hours when it's all painted. And then I realize, oh, the eyes are too big and too low. So if it seems like I'm just drawing and redrawing these really basic and not so meaningful things, it's because I've made that mistake so many times of just diving into the really fun stuff like the features of the face without actually thinking where they are, where they're sitting on the page. I just have to add a little bit to the bottom here. Just brought up the bottom a little bit, just looking at the photo and where things were lining up. Maybe the head was a little too high. I don't want to move it around too much just for the sake of the demo. I don't want this to be a drawing demo. I want it to be a painting demo. But as much as I'm looking at this line, like the line of the shoulder and the neck of the head, I'm also looking at this negative shape around the head. So it's not just that head construction stuff. And I keep stepping back, looking at it from further away. Sometimes I'll like prop it up like this so I can back up a little bit more. But again, before I worry about any of the features of the face, I want to make sure the head is the right size proportional to these shoulders. I want to make sure everything's in the right place. So we're spending a little bit more time on this painting and being a little bit more thoughtful about composition. All right, and now I'll start to think. I'm kind of retracing my steps back to where I started before, thinking about the eye socket, bridge of the nose, meeting the brow, and just the distance from the edge of this eye socket to where that wetsuit is. But later on, if I'm painting this edge of the hood of the wetsuit, I want to have the most perfect brushstroke that I can with the right color, with the right amount of pigment and water and lightness and darkness and the right kind of edge. I don't also want to think, is this even in the right place? Is it the right size and shape? It might be the right size and shape, but like an eighth of an inch to the left of where it actually should have been. So, and I don't want to, it's never going to be perfect. We're not trying to make a painted photo. Remember, our cameras work great for that. Just we can take a photo if that's what we need. But we want to make the best painting we can possibly make. And I kind of try and make each brushstroke count. Not to the point where it gives us some kind of anxiety, but we don't want to be paralyzed with fear. But I'm just saying that's why I spend this time on the drawing. It kind of loosens me up later. So it's not really for the sake of being more rigid and more measured and analytical, but being more careful now allows me to be looser later. All right, that might be close enough for me. I'll zoom in a little bit. So again, it's not for all that time I spent, maybe that was 20 minutes or so. It's not that detailed. It's still pretty simple, but I do feel like it's pretty accurate, or as accurate as I need it to be or I'm willing to get for right now. I feel like I like this piece of the hood right here. I feel like this curves down kind of right in a similar, like vertically, where this one curves up. I think that's kind of interesting. So any like little abstract patterns you might see that you discover along the way of your drawing, that's really useful information too. If a painting is a record of not just what we see, but how we see, spending time on that drawing is kind of like driving through this image over and over again. Your drawing is like the residue of the path of your eye through it. So that kind of getting to know the image in that way sets us up for what we might want to focus on in the painting. Because it's not about painting everything that you see and leaving stuff out. Knowing when to do that, that can be tricky too. So I always refer to like something like a drawing, even if it's not totally conscious, like what I thought was meaningful and is what I spent more time on. But that's going to happen regardless. So I'm going to lighten this all a little bit with my eraser. after I sip my coffee. And I'm just dragging the kneaded eraser across it really lightly. And again, make sure there's no trash in your eraser. Don't leave your kneaded eraser around toddlers and then use it for a watercolor sketch.
You like the kneaded eraser the best,
Yeah,
okay.
I'm just so used to it. What else do we have here? I have the other kind floating. Oh, it's in my other school bag, the more like rigid plastic one. But yeah, I like this the best. I'm just so used to it. I don't know. I mean, you can push it around into different shapes and everything. And so if it's just like a block, sometimes that plane of that corner can be a little bit rigid, where this one I can be a little bit looser and softer with it.
The problem I found is they were difficult to clean once they get all this stuff on them.
Yeah, once they're truly like used up, I mean, the more you stretch it around like this, that kind of it kind of shuffles around whatever charcoal or graphite might be in there, and it'll get lighter. Let me see if I can find a really nastier one in here. So these are both pretty old. Let's see how dark this one really is if I stretch it out. But they last a pretty long time.
Yeah.
Honestly, and I didn't even think of this, probably my favorite part about this eraser, it doesn't like sprinkle that dusty dirt eraser stuff all over. So especially for a watercolor painting, getting that everywhere can be really annoying.
I think they also do the least damage for the paper that we use. It's so fragile.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes that other eraser is it's more like it's like a brick.
Yeah, it's grinding away at the surface.
Yeah. These you can like it's almost like I can like push this down, push it into the paper and just like lift up.
That's what I do. That's what I do to just
Yeah.
kind of, yeah, it works really well.
Like you spilled wine on a rug, gotta lift it out. You don't want to you don't want to scrub it. So I'm just like grazing the top. I'm not like scoring the eraser in there. Oops. And then if I want to, I can, if it's more of a drawing thing, but if I want to get really, really precise, I can basically
Shane? Oh, excuse me.
like a tip of a pencil that I can draw with. Yes.
Okay, I just came across this pen that we used in the charcoal class. It's called um, it's not a pencil, it's a eraser. Pentel Click Eraser. And anyway, you push the the thing down, and you get um, the rest of the eraser to come down with it.
That's
Okay,
cool.
so these are really good for lifting lines and softening areas for
Yeah.
like charcoal mainly. That's what we used in the charcoal class.
Yeah.
But it's a Pentel brand. I got it
Nice.
over at Michael's. And then they
That's
make a real thin one too, so you can really make those soft edges, that you were talking about.
yeah.
It works really good to soften things up.
Yeah.
Pentel is the brand. So,
Okay. I
right?
gotta check one of those out.
Yeah.
Good for like let's say we're doing a really complex drawing of this. If we wanted to like erase out that piece of that eyelid right there, it'd be easy if you have one of those eraser pens. It's easier with that than the kneaded eraser, probably. All right. I feel like we're all set with this. So I'm gonna start with the background, that blue sky. I'm gonna use a larger brush. And I think I mentioned it the other day, but the sky, the blue of the sky can sometimes get a little richer as you get further from the horizon. I'm gonna do a mix of ultramarine blue and cerulean. But you can do whatever you want in the sky if you want to experiment with the wet into wet and just kind of pooling up different
Yeah.
colors.
I did that and you saw it didn't work out so well.
Let me take a look at yours again. I mostly looked at the
Uh,
face on yours. I lost it. Here it is. So yours, so, and let me show this now before I make a mark on here. I sometimes, I mean, I do this in painting sometimes too, where like if I follow along this like
Yeah,
contour of the head too much, it'll create this like radiating effect. So
right.
if we can be aware of that and like try and hide our brushstrokes a little bit more, what's good about this reference, what I like about it for a portrait, especially for a demo for class, it we have this wetsuit barrier like around the face. So the face is like this little island of like warm skin tones. This really cool blue sky back here can run into the wetsuit here, and even the light parts of the wetsuit, let's say this light, the sun's hitting it right here, it's still pretty dark. So we know we're gonna paint right through, we can paint over that blue sky.
Yeah,
So I'm not gonna be like when we were painting those snowy mountains, it was hard because the blue sky came right up against those white shapes of the light hitting the snow. We had to be pretty careful about wherever we painted the sky, we were kind of creating the mountain below it. A little bit more wiggle room on this one with getting that absolutely perfect, but above all, we can try to avoid that like pulling up of the color right
right.
all around the figure. Real quick, I just noticed I should gotta raise that shoulder just a little bit. Kind of always change my mind about which blue I like more for like a blue sky, or at least the blue that's usually above my head outside here. That's where I took this photo. And we could, if we wanted to, we could activate the paper a little bit first with a little bit more water.
Did you put water on the paper first? I didn't see.
No, but that's what I was saying. Like, if you want to, you can. But this is sort of just wet and to dry. But if you want to, you can. That's how, let's try it just for the sake of the demo. I'll take some clean water and I can just move some of that pigment around. I'm just covering this all with water. If you're on a individual sheet of watercolor paper and you're doing big washes like this, you want to make sure your paper is like nailed, or it's not nailed, like taped or stapled down so it doesn't buckle too much, because all that water will buckle the page a lot easier. But we can, sort of experiment with how the pigment is moved around the page. See right here, I'm a little afraid of that, of how it's getting darker right up against the edge of the figure. And remember, the blue tends to be a little bit lighter towards the horizon. So I'm going to try and push this pigment further up towards the top, and then a little bit more ultramarine towards the top of the page. Might even lift out a little bit of this blue here. Kind of like how that looks. Softening everything with the rag like that. Kind of a nice texture. I'm like scrubbing it into the page. Never really done that before, but it looks kind of cool.
Yeah, that looks good.
Thank you.
Uh, I haven't seen that where you put it on the put on the wash, dry it off.
Yeah, wasn't on purpose, but
Uh,
I just want it to be like unified. I
yeah,
like
and you avoided all those brush strokes that I got into.
Yeah, I like having like a flat kind of
Yeah.
graphic blue sky background. Unless, I mean, sometimes I only want to paint clouds, so it could go either way, like with having a really exciting background or a really kind of flat, boring one. Sometimes I like a nice, boring, flat sky because it really brings the face into like a super crisp focus. Maybe I'll push it a little bit more across the top. I'm gonna use a bigger brush too. If you use too small of a brush, like I'm always thinking about how can I do this in the least amount of brush strokes possible. So I've got this giant mega brush here. So that's like is this like the Mottler brush? Oh no, just flat wash. There's another one that says Mottler. This one, it's a little bit shorter. There's just a big flat wash. It's an inch and a half. So since the wetsuit itself is darker, and we're gonna do multiple passes on each of these shapes, mostly the wetsuit and the face back and forth, kind of redefining each other. But I'm gonna start off with the face, I think, because it's lighter, and then I know I can paint over that with the darkness of the wetsuit. So any like especially dark pencil lines in here, I'm gonna lighten even more. A lot of that drawing was also just like kind of just figuring it out. So if I found it once, I can find it again with the paint. Like as long as I have a couple things I know I can rely on, especially like in here, I know there's just a ton of light in there, so I don't want really chunky pencil lines showing up there. And if you like how the pencil lines look, that is a whole other thing. Then go for it with leaving the pencil lines in, but be aware of how it's going to mix in with your pigments. We could zoom in down on like a microscopic level. We could think about these big chunks of graphite floating around the hills and valleys of our paper, mixing into the really bright and clear and warm skin tones we're going to paint over it. That's going to make it a little bit like dirtier. I'm going to use this brush. It's like my medium sized. It's at number 10, but a medium sized round brush. And I'm going to start off with the really light and bright stuff. I'm going to make sure I have a little bit of like blue paint still floating around in here. I want to make sure I clean that out totally. that blue from the sky. It's basically like a complementary color to the orange in the face. We don't want those two mixing together accidentally. But I'm gonna grab some cad yellow and some cad red for that like bright orange kind of right in through here. And I'm gonna do a wash to try and capture that like glow of the face, like in anticipating coming back and sharpening up, so like finessing some of those forms. I'm just gonna put a wash through the face here, just as like a general skin tone. Thinking about where the lightest light is, like maybe on that plane change near the tip of the nose here, maybe a little bit on that like inside corner, the side plane of the nose. It's not quite the white of the paper, but it's pretty bright. So I just want to be aware of that. But that's one thing I remember from my color study, which I'm supposed to have out right here next to me. Let me get that real quick. I told everyone to do that and then I didn't do it myself. We want to have your color study nearby just as a reference.
That's cad yellow and what did you say?
Cad yellow and cad red, a tiny bit of quinacridone magenta, like a really small amount. And I'm just looking at the light shape in general. And then I can lift out some of the lighter areas. Might even, I'm gonna clean up my brush. But I can wrap this rag around the tip of the brush handle and sort of draw with my rag here, just like I would with the kneaded eraser. And I'm gonna pull out some of the lighter spots. And I'm just thinking about how sorry, I just looked at the screen. It's so hard to see with that glare. Don't know how to fix that. The glare showing up. Sorry about that. Um, there's a couple areas where it goes from yellow to a little bit more pink. I'm gonna push the quinacridone magenta on those spots. So like here on the cheek, it's a little bit more red, but like a cooler red, like a pinker red. You could use a alizarin crimson for that too. And if you only have cad red, or if you only have one kind of red, just you can stick with that. So here near the tip of the nose, it gets pushed a little bit more red too, but it's a little bit lighter. So I'm gonna use a little bit more water. But this is all in anticipation of coming back in with the shadows on top of that to really give this some more depth and form. So I'm really just looking at like the gradient of the light shape from warm. I mean, it's all pretty warm, but from like between yellow and red. And where the light is brightest. And it'll dry pretty light. Like obviously this is all very bright and I'm not using much pigment. I don't want it to get too dark too fast. So just a wash to get us going. So now I'll let that dry, and if I'm going to come back in and do some of the wetsuit now, I'll start down here just to give this a second to dry. Just for where the wetsuit meets the face, I do want to be really specific about that. They're all pretty sharp forms, which means it'll be wet into dry. So I want to make sure that it's nice and dry before I do that. So I'll start down here for the wetsuit and then I'll make my way up. And this too, I want to just do a general dark shape, paying attention to like the overall gradient of everything. I remember we talked about that a lot with the skull too. Like there are all these little facets of light and shadow. There's a form shadow under the jaw. There's more of a cast shadow under the brim of that wetsuit, over here near the armpit. But there's also some larger, slower transitions. I feel like this shoulder is a little bit further away from us. It looks a little bit darker than this shoulder that's getting a little bit more light. I want to think about the roundness of the whole head before we put in all of these smaller forms on top of it. So I always think of things as like these like small, medium, and large forms, and we want to do the large forms first. Sorry, there's some like fuzz in the paint right here. We want to do the large, more underlying forms first. Like if I'm painting the ocean has like bigger waves and then medium-sized waves on top of it, and then smaller waves on top of that. We have to start with like the more underlying foundational ones first. That's how I approach painting anything, but people especially. So for this wetsuit, and I'm looking at my color study from last week. I kind of remember the light shape in the wetsuit being a little bit more of a warmer gray in the context of the shadow shape being darker and cooler and pushing that a little bit more violet. So I feel like to offset that violet, we could push the light shape to be more of like a warm greenish yellow. So I'm going to do some ultramarine blue and some burnt sienna to make a dark gray. And then maybe I'll add in some yellow ochre to the mix, which will just warm that up a tiny bit. It'll still be pretty, it's a pretty muddy color. I don't want to see any of those three colors too distinctly. So if you see too much brown, add more blue. If you see too much blue, add a little bit more of the brown. And let the yellow ochre find its way in there just a little bit. And this as well, I don't want it to be too dark. Even though the wetsuit itself is pretty dark, we're really kind of addressing like what, like the value and the temperature of the light shape of it. This is like a really basic blueprint for our painting. So again, maybe over here, if this is something I can address more wet into wet, it's a little bit darker and bluer near this arm over here. I'll get into this shadow under the jaw a bit later, but since it's all wet, I can do at least a little softer indication of that. A little bit of a plane change here on that part of the shoulder. Maybe that was a little heavy-handed. Maybe I'll push this form shadow on the top of the head up here. This shadow from that little fabric of the neoprene coming over this shoulder and like describing that whole plane of it's like wrapping around the shoulder muscle there, coming down across the collarbones and towards like the front plane of the rib cage, that line. Those are all pretty small and sharp, so I'm going to wait on those. That's why I'm not addressing that right now. That'll be more of a wet into dry thing later on, I think. But I can push some of this softer roundness over here. The pigments are kind of separating themselves too in the palette, and that's I see it happening on the painting now too, and I kind of like that. If I didn't want that, I would do a better job mixing them together with the brush before I put it on the paper, but I do kind of like how what's happening with that. I feel like the different parts of the wetsuit are like aging at different rates based on how much of it is in the sun, how much it moves around. Usually the shoulders go on the wetsuits a lot quicker because of the paddling and just moving around a bit more, but I love how that affects all the different colors and edges, and I just think it's fun to paint wetsuits. I'm just trying to soften this edge here a little bit with some more water. So I'm gonna let this all sit for a minute. We can take a break right now and just kind of let this all dry out. I'm gonna change out the water here in the water cup. I think we've got a good setup so far. It's 10:18. If we take a 10-minute break, we can come back at 10:28 and we'll take it from there and start picking this thing apart. Are there any questions so far? All right.
Shane, you used CAD red and CAD yellow for the cut of the facial background.
Yeah. And a little bit of that magenta color, the quinacridone magenta, for like some of those more pink areas, like on that red part of the cheek. Since it's more red but a little bit cool, CAD red is a lot warmer. Also, I'm leaving that shadow under the brim of the wetsuit there until later too. So just don't uh go off on that too quickly either. All right, it's 20 after. I'll come back in 10 minutes, folks. Hi, everybody. Forgot to clean off my palette. So I want to go back into the face and start to map out those shadows. So, and I remember this just looking at the color study too. We want to be aware of the light and dark within the shadows and the warm and cool. I feel like the side of the face that has more light on it has warmer shadows than these cast shadows on the left side of the face seem a little bit cooler. And going back to the color study again, I'm just gonna point with my pencil. You can see like these are a little bit more like brownish, yellow, ochre, or red maybe. This is a little bit more violet, still pretty warm, but more of like a magenta, pinkish, reddish kind of a violet. So kind of navigating between those two, letting those two run into each other as well is I think how I want to go about this. So having the two different sections of my palette reflect that too will be important. Another reason why that color study can really come in handy, we can figure those things out on a simpler playing field without all of the more complicated shapes we're going to be seeing today. You can still see my drawing just barely, even if it's not showing up on your screen there. I'm going to start off with these warmer shadows in here. I'm going to grab some burnt sienna to start. So if I need to go dark and warm, burnt sienna is always a good place to go. Since it's pretty dark and also really warm, I'm adding some yellow ochre to that and a little bit of cad red for like a really golden, super warm shadow color, like a dark orange. You could always say burnt sienna is like a dark version of orange, but this one's a little bit more saturated with the yellow and the red in it. Add a little bit more water before I go too dark. And just gonna lightly navigate my way around this drawing. This shadow here, this inside corner of the eye socket, I'm gonna use this as like a important landmark. keystone shape I can keep coming back to. So the brow is casting a shadow down into the eye socket. So that form shadow edge on the top of the brow is going to be softer. Even if it's a little bit firmer, more on the right side, it's softer more on the left as it rolls up towards the forehead. Then the bottom edge of it is that cast shadow edge. It's a little bit sharper. So I'm adding more water to that top side. There's a really thin, like simple line almost for that cast shadow of the nostril. It's pretty dark. It's one of the darker shadows on the face, but I'm not going to jump that dark right from the start. I want to make sure it's in the right place with the right angle. But I'm just using this lighter, warmer shadow color just to get started. The mustache here, this is like a similar temperature, like this darker yellow orange. I don't want to mistake it for like form though. It has form on its own, meaning that it like turns down towards the shadow. So I don't want to use the shadow color to paint this whole thing, but I am gonna drag a little bit of it around just as a placeholder. Especially right under the nose, it catches a little bit more light there as it gets kind of like pushed out. So I'll do a little bit more water there. And then below the bottom lip, there's a little bit of a downward facing plane there. So I'm just really lightly indicating. There's lots of variations within the light part of the face, everything getting hit by the light. There's variations of light and dark within it, just like within the shadows. But when we're mapping out shadow shapes, it's important to like really be decisive about what's getting hit with direct light and what's not. So this cast shadow to the left of the nose is a good example of that. We want to map out the shape of that shadow. Think about why it's shaped the way that it is based on where the light is. This is that one that's it's darker and a little bit cooler. So I'm using quinacridone magenta with a little bit of ultramarine blue. Maybe I'll mix in a little bit of cad yellow and cad red to give it some of that warmth, some of that orange of the skin tone underneath, but really the blue and the magenta are gonna darken it and cool it off. So this shadow, like it's in the left eye socket to the left of the bridge of the nose here. This cast shadow is going to help define the shape of the nose itself. even though we're not painting the nose itself, if that makes sense. Just like over here where we painted the wetsuit, defined the edge of the cheek. It's a similar thing happening here. This shadow to the left of the nose is really defining the positive space of the nose itself, which is important. So we want to be careful with that. Not using too much pigment or too much water, wet into dry. Remember, a cast shadow describes a few things at once. Tells us about the shape of the object casting the shadow, tells us about where the light source is, but it also tells us about the surface it's being cast onto, like that cheek on our left side, and where it kind of rolls off to the side here. I'm going to soften all of that because it runs into this reflected light kind of up the left side of the face here from that blue sky. Here where that cooler shadow meets this like warmer shadow on the facial hair below, I'm going to let these two meet. I'm going to soften that edge on the tip of the nose as it like rolls down towards that shadow. There's a little bit of a form shadow before it turns to that extra dark cast shadow behind it. Really what we want to be looking for here is what we see when we squint. That's the best way to break up light and shadow. If you can't see it when you're squinting, it's not that important right now. There's some light catching this bottom eyelid here. And I'm just going to unify that with the rest, or up the shadow around it. I'm unifying that with the rest of this cast shadow here too. Which lightens up kind of around the rest of the eye socket and on this left side of the face here.
What were you using, Shane, for the cooler shadow there that you're doing? Could looks a
I,
little purple.
I use some ultramarine blue and the quinacridone magenta. And then I mixed in a little bit of that cad yellow and cad red from the other mixture to warm it up a little bit. I'm using a lighter version of that warmer color over here to finish off like that shape of the eye.
Could you use alizarin rather than the magenta for
Yes.
the cooler shadows?
Yeah, definitely. The alizarin's going to be a little bit more powerful. It's going to stain a little bit more. It might be a little bit darker, and it might kind of control that mixture a little bit more. So maybe use a little bit less of it. Just be careful, be aware of like how much alizarin you're using. The magenta is a little bit lighter. It can be more saturated, but the alizarin crimson is just really like a dense pigment. I should follow my own advice and stop messing around with this red on the cheek over here because that's more like on the lighter side of things. So ignore me when I don't listen to myself. Sorry. Got distracted over there. So over here, I want to pay attention to how this cast shadow gets sort of like wrapped around the cheek. It's coming down here along the nose, and then it starts to turn in towards that edge of the wetsuit there, and it gets lighter along that edge. So we can really, again, we're going to redefine that edge when we darken the wetsuit next to it. I want to drag out this shadow a little bit more and I want to be aware of this light shape next to the mouth down here. The tricky little area, but the way to simplify all of this is just paint what's in shadow up against what's in the light as simply as you can. The only variation within that we're really looking at right now is temperature and edge. Is it warmer or cooler? And is it a softer, a firmer, or a sharper edge? I'm grabbing some of my more of that magenta or alizarin part of the shadow here. A little bit more, pushing it a little bit more red and a little bit more water to lighten it. I'm going to dampen the brush a little bit and just kind of ride along this edge of the mouth here, casting like more of like a red shadow beneath the mustache. I don't want it to be too harsh of a straight line. So I'm just going to break it up a little bit. And then that meets up with this shadow over here at the other corner of the mouth. That forms coming from like sort of this like side plane of that mouth. Remember, if you think of the mouth as a sphere, it's coming from that, and then ultimately that like facial hair on top of it. This edge up here might be a little bit sharp too. Remember that line of the shadow along the brow is more of a firm edge than a sharp one. So I'm gonna loosen this up just a tiny bit. It's still kind of wet. It's more like it's damp. It's not totally wet, so I can still activate it and soften that a tiny bit. And then we should get into that cast shadow across the brow too while we're up there. So that one is darker and also pretty red. I want to say it's a little bit warmer than like this more cooler violet cast shadow on the left side that we started with. So we want to get dark, but also sort of red. Well, I'm just fixing this edge here on the nose. Remember, this is kind of softer down towards the bottom. It's good enough for now, I think. Oh yeah, so that cast shadow underneath that brim. Let's try some burnt sienna, some alizarin crimson. We could try just those two to start. If it gets too warm, we could add a little bit of blue to darken it and also cool it off, ultramarine blue. Is that cast shadow? The shadow itself is on the skin of the forehead. It's not part of the wetsuit. It's coming from the wetsuit, but it's not necessarily the wetsuit itself. So our shadow would have to be a shadow on the skin tones. Even though it's dark, it's darker than the rest because of how far out forward that form comes. You can always darken it more later, but this is really going like from more of a that burnt sienna, alizarin crimson with a little bit of blue on the right side over here to more of that warmer shadow from earlier that has more yellow in it.
Would you still call that a warm shadow?
Yeah, yeah. Compared to like underneath the chin over here, that would be cooler. Even though if we look closely at the photo, they both turn to black, but I'm kind of ignoring black because that's kind of a leftover from the photo, I think. Even if it was truly black, just for the sake of the painting, I want to try and push the colors to work together or against each other, whichever I want. I see that as being more of like a warm shadow. So yeah, you're right. Also, a really light little thing that I noticed down here. I'm going to add more water to keep it super light, but just kind of underneath here, this small little form right there, using that warmer shadow shape. Okay, I feel like that's a good starting point to pass through the shadows there. So we can let that dry. My strategy for the painting is just kind of let the face dry and work on the wetsuit, then let the wetsuit dry and work on the face. So I'm gonna clean off my palette a bit here. I'm gonna use this larger round brush for this. What I want to do is look at the shadows throughout the wetsuit. They mostly seem darker and cooler than what I have here already. So again, I don't know if I'm projecting this with the way that I look at things now, or if it really is there. I feel like the light shape of the wetsuit has some warmth to it, some yellow to it. So by pushing the cool, darker and cooler shadows more into like a blue violet zone, that might counteract that yellowness in a interesting way. So I always try and like play the colors against each other or towards each other, whichever is whatever is useful, just to give the painting a little bit something a little bit more interesting than just exactly what the camera saw. I might add a little bit of yellow ochre to this to keep it from getting too violet, but it's mostly ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson. Two darkest pigments that also add up to uh, violet or purple, which is what we want. Just pushing the blue a little bit more. So one place we can start, I'm going to back this up a little bit. One place we can start is from the top of the shoulder, like rising up towards the front of the neck. It starts out as a darker and sharper cast shadow and moves up and becomes like a slightly lighter and softer form shadow. So again, just thinking in brush strokes, I'm thinking about how I'm gonna drag that up and out from there. And there's like a little bit of a extra form here where the hood really wraps around the face. And I feel like as it turns up here, it kind of mixes into that light shape with a little bit more yellow as it turns up towards the light. So while this is all still activated, I'm going to soften all of these edges. So instead of adding just water to soften them, I'm adding a little bit of that yellow ochre to show that color as it turns towards the light. That's generally where we see the most color is right after the core of the shadow as it's turning from dark into light. We don't really see the color so much in the highlights themselves. or in the darkest, deepest, darkest parts of the shadows. It's where light and shadow meet in the midtones that the color is most potent. Maybe this could go a little bit more blue-green instead of yellow and purple. It's all so gray anyway that I'm kind of maybe being a little too imaginative with what we're seeing there. Whatever you end up doing with the color or the temperature, it doesn't matter quite as much as the values and the edges. So this is kind of rolling back. In here, there's like a really interesting little section of different kinds of edges. Sorry for this glare on the screen. It's like this light bulb or something, the way the light hits the water. Not a light expert, so I don't know exactly what it is, but I gotta figure out a way to get rid of that glare. But in here, we see like some sharper edges that these two open up into softer edges out in this direction. So since this is all pretty activated already, I'm gonna focus on the softer transitions. I can always sharpen it up later. But looking into here, as this form kind of climbs up the side of the face, there is a light shape in here, so I want to be extra careful about that. But that, like, you can see the thickness of the neoprene of the wetsuit in like how it kind of bulges up against the face like that. And there's these tiny little form shadows right up in here. So again, most of that is going to be darker and sharper and like really small and crisp later on. But I'm just moving some of these wet into wet shapes around just to see what I can do with the color. I should also soften this whole thing here. This arc here of the rim of the hood over here, remember that apex of that curve is like the forwardmost point, which is going to be the middle of the forehead here. So just be aware of those curves. Anytime you're making a curve, think like, where does this thing, what is the apex of the curve? Where does it start turning from one point to another? So again, to soften that edge, I'm adding some water and dragging the pigment across and then going back with the rag from the other direction to get a nice soft and smooth wet into wet transition there. The more we build up these like slower, softer forms and be really thoughtful about where the wet into wet can go, the easier it's going to be to come back in with some sharper marks later, and we can do a lot more with a lot less because we've already built up so much form putting in the work in the way that we are right now. So I'm taking more of this darker color from earlier, that violet, to go down to this warm shadow edge on the arm. Same with this one here for the armpit, which is really pretty dark. Here's a more watered down version of that same color that I'm just gonna do like a transparent glaze over it. This is just like a transparent shadow, just to give that shoulder a little bit of form there. Not quite as dark as these ones over here. I'm gonna use the larger, this really big brush for this really transparent layer. So if you look over here in my palette, you can see this is that darker one. This is the really thin layer that I want to do just to give this a little bit more of a tone all the way across. So to keep it from getting too violet, I'm just adding more and more of that yellow ochre. But I'm thinking about like the front plane of the chest here being just a little bit darker than this shoulder, getting a little bit more light over here, and then the top of like from the collarbone up to the jaw also has some more light on it. So these over here might be a little bit more blue. So just while we're here, I want to like loosen this up a little bit. Those angles of the neck were a little too rigid. So here I'm taking that same shadow color and I'm being really careful about how I can define the edge of the face using that sharp shadow of the wetsuit right up against it. Lots of really tiny little shapes right here that are really important. Tells us the shape of the face and the head, but also how that like neoprene's kind of right up against it. All right, well, so much for me sharpening up the wetsuit shadow shapes. I just kind of made a big washy puddle again. I like how it looks though. I feel like there is like a washiness and like an abstract quality of all those colors mixing together when I look at the wetsuit in the photo. This shoulder be a little bit lighter and more yellow, I think.
Did you do mostly wet into wet on the wetsuit, Shane?
Yeah. I started off with like sharper and darker shapes, but it kind of just turned into like a washy, full washy thing. My buddy Peter's here. I work with him as a lifeguard. He's just borrowing a surfboard, but I'm just showing him what we're working on. Yeah, we're doing a portrait of Howdy in the wetsuit. Do you know Howdy? Yeah. All right. Oh, whoops. So it looks like this edge just bled into this sky. That's no good. Kind of like that soft edge though. All right, so now that we've kind of like we've gone back into the wetsuit again, I'm gonna go back into the sky. We're kind of alternating between the two, letting one dry while the other dries. For the face now, we can kind of just repeat what we just did. I feel like the relationships are there, the shapes are there. We've got our light and dark and warm and cool and like softer and sharper edges. I gotta clean off the palette again. But we can just push all that a little bit further. It's not necessarily adding more information, but we can make it more accurate without making it more complicated at the same time. And I'm gonna go back where we started. It's really gonna be like a repeat of what we did earlier, but this cast shadow right there on like the inside corner of the eye socket, more on the warmer side. So I've got some burnt sienna, some yellow ochre, and we could put in a little bit of cad red or the quinacridone magenta. That could kind of go either way. I feel like it's more red on the bottom half of that cast shadow, so I'll push this magenta over here on the side. And again, as far as thinking about like what to paint and what to leave out, if our goal is to capture the likeness, this shadow really, really matters. So I want to make sure the shape is right and the edges make sense. It's a little bit less saturated towards the top. So maybe I'll mix up some of that cooler shadow color on the other half of my palette here, just to then use that to desaturate this half, if that makes sense. Mostly ultramarine blue and magenta. But so now to desaturate this a little bit, I'm gonna just mix them together. Basically gives me like a warm gray. And then that's really what's like where the brow meets the inside plane of the eye socket, which meets the side plane of the nose over near the bridge of the nose. It's like a softer form shadow on top and then the sharper cast shadow on the bottom. And then that eye socket on the left is like way more cool. We could like push this a lot darker over here, but I kind of like it being a little bit more vacant. I always, whenever I do a portrait, I feel like we really look at one eye more than the other. And it's kind of just a thing left over from the camera seeing both eyes evenly. So I noticed that in like Rembrandt self portraits, which are like some of my favorites. But if you look at any good portrait done from life, we usually see one eye, see into one eye a little bit more than the others. One eye is usually a little bit closer to us, unless we're looking straight on. Just something to think about. You could paint both eyes perfectly, but something a little more human about just painting the one a little bit more, a little bit crispier than the other. And just in general, I treat the eyes pretty much like every other form or feature on the face. Really easy to overdo it with the eyes because we just we like weigh them so much more heavily with meaning. I think like leaving them kind of quiet and subtle, we're still gonna like look into it as much as we normally would. So I don't know, there's lots of room for like leaving that gap for the viewer to figure out. Then I'd rather that than like over describe the eyes and make it a little bit more cartoonish. That like cool magenta is what I'm using to like build up a little bit of that form. Remember, this whole eye socket's more in the light than the other. So all these values are just way brighter and like more compressed. And then that like sunburned cheek right here gonna be way more red. I think last time I mentioned the magenta for that one, I think the CAD red might work a little better for whatever reason this time around. Remember that CAD red is another like really dense color. It's pretty opaque. So we don't want to overdo it too much here. Remember that you are like, we're in this light shape here. This isn't a shadow. It's more of a local color thing. It's getting a little bit less direct light than like this side plane of the head, but still a local color thing. You could use that same like really saturated orangey color, like CAD red, a little bit of magenta and a little bit of CAD yellow, and like thin it out with water. Dry your brush off a little bit, and you can like round out this plane change on the front of the nose here. Because it's not just a clean break into that cast shadow, like we want that to roll away from us a little bit. So by giving it a little bit of color there, I think that'll help. And then later we can push that shadow even further because it's definitely a lot darker than what we had. So like depending on how much pigment and how much water we're using right here, it'll either look more real or it'll look like he like smeared paint all over his face. So I'm using the rag to just pick some of that up. So I think it's a little closer than it was. Again, we could come back with more and more and more layers, but we don't want to overwork it. But step in the right direction, even if I didn't get it as dark as I really wanted it to. I'm just looking at these little like half tones on the side plane of the nose. So I'm kind of painting around the highlights. Oh, and then before I forget, we could put this down here too. Plenty more of that bright orange. And on this cheek too. We could let this dry a little bit too before we push. So now we're kind of setting ourselves up to push that cast shadow again. And if any of this seems too dark right now, I kind of know that the wetsuit itself is going to get pushed way, way darker later. Right now, they almost share a value, but when this, I could even put in like a placeholder. Sometimes I do this just so I kind of have an idea of where the values are going to go, and then it gets easier to like read them all. Even that is maybe not quite dark enough. Could go over here too. This one that frames the face. So just that kind of tells me that this eye has plenty more room to push the super dark colors. I'm not going to go any further because there's some like pulled up water right there. I don't want, now we're being way more careful now. I don't want those to like bleed into any uh areas I don't want them to. I gotta hand Peter his surfboard. I'll be back in 1 minute. All righty, we're cruising along here. I feel like this face is dry enough to maybe do one more round darkening that same cooler shadow over here. This more violet one. I might get out the even smaller brush now. So this lightens and gets more red as it gets further from the nose. So remember, as the cast shadow gets further away from the object casting it, it's going to get a little bit less strong. Well, see, that was still a little damp over there. Thought it was drier, but might be losing a little bit of my edges here in the face. Maybe I should leave it for a minute. Okay, maybe I'll push this shadow again in the wetsuit. I'll use this violet I already have here. Add some alizarin crimson, make everything darker. Some burnt sienna. And really push the shadows here before we run out of time today.
That's burnt sienna and alizarin
Yeah,
crimson.
and lots of ultramarine blue.
Ah,
Also, I don't want to forget about that line over here for this wetsuit hood. So I like how this line kind of comes across the shoulders. 'Cause it really defines the form of the shoulders and will make the figure less of a just a silhouetted shape like this. The way it kind of rolls around this, the trapezius muscle comes out towards the collarbones here, kind of bumping over them, which it gives us the sense that they're a little bit closer to us than this edge over here, even though it's a really shallow amount of depth. I think it's important. And then over here, that line of the zipper is like a really sensitive little, but sensitive but powerful little line. So cool compositional element. I love these little cast shadows over here showing the creases in the fabric. Little bit of like a softer edge mixed in with some of those sharper cast shadows out near like the edges here. Let's see if I can pull those out a little bit. Right around here. So if I add a little bit of water to the smaller clean brush, maybe I can break open that edge a little bit in the direction that that whole shadow's moving in. I don't like how this turned out over here, this line. I'm gonna try and simplify it. Not quite enough time to really like finesse all that in the way that I wanted to. I think I underestimated the complexity of the wetsuit. It seems so much simpler than it is. But I mean, it was really an exercise in painting the portrait. As much as I want to make this a good, complete painting, I think the wetsuit, maybe I'll just give it a couple more washes on top after it dries. This painting might need another 6 hours. Fun to make though. I had fun with just setting it all up. One thing we should, or I should go over just for the sake of the demo so you can all take it a little bit further, is I was thinking a lot about the wetsuit meeting the face because we don't want these all to be too separated. So right along here, there's this really sharp edge. I'm gonna push this a little bit darker. The way that like neoprene like wraps around the head like that, I think is important. There's a lighter and softer and more colorful shadow along here for that like that form that kind of follows around the edge of the hood. I mixed a little bit of cerulean blue into that violet color. Okay, hopefully that tip of the nose area is pretty dry, and I might give that one more shot before we're done here. So I'm going to clean all these wetsuit colors off of my palette. No matter what you're painting, it's good to just clean your palette off pretty frequently and just keep starting fresh so you really know like exactly what pigments are on the tip of your brush as you're using them. Just so you don't run the risk of polluting your colors and turning everything into a muddy puddle. Cleaning my brushes out too. I'm going to start off with just taking some watered down magenta just on its own to see if I can use that to rebuild this shadow here. And then I could darken that facial hair shadow too, which is just like a really dark brown, kind of greenish in a way. So I'm going to do burnt sienna and some raw umber. Up here in the eye socket, I feel like that shadow goes a little bit more blue. So still on the periphery of violet, but more on the blue side. So if I just take some cerulean, let's just see if I can push the shadow. I remember this part of the wetsuit's still kind of wet, so I don't want to disrupt that, but I just push some of these a little bit. Maybe I can carve out a little bit more depth to this. I think this light shape of the lower eyelid got too sharp. Remember, the eye is round. That form of the eyelid is wrapping around the eyeball, so it should get darker as it gets further away from the light source, even though it's on such a small scale. Rounding that out is going to give it some more dimension, I think. using that magenta and the cerulean, and still just kind of reestablishing some edges, carving some things out. Shape of the nose. Everything's been kind of like so soft and light for so long that we still have room to push those edges and values. The more we do that, the more sure of ourselves we can be about it, and that helps. We can like really trust each brushstroke while we're in it. And I forgot about this shadow over here from earlier. So even this one, I know we're almost done here, folks, but on the edge of that cheek there, it's a really subtle, simple shadow, but it's a slower form shadow transition on the top edge. Slower change from light to dark, followed by a sharper edge below it. So you can stay aware of those little relationships as on as small a scale as you want. As you work on it this week, think about getting out of your comfort zone, pushing yourself. We've made a lot of like pretty complete paintings, but not necessarily finished paintings. So if you want to try and redefine what that might mean to finish a painting, this is a good chance for it. Never going to be enough time to get everything perfect either, so just think about what we can accomplish. Like for me, it's in a couple hours during a demo. You've got a little bit more time working on it during the week. But again, it's never going to be enough time to make a photorealistic version of this. And I don't even think I'm not even sure that that's worth doing, because I think what you can make in a painting is a lot more interesting than what a photo can capture. So for whatever that's all worth, take whatever's useful for your painting from the photo and leave out the rest.